Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. We're delighted to have you with us and looking forward to a rich conversation. My name is Greg Forster. I'm the director of the Oikonomia Network. The Oikonomia Network is a learning community of theological educators and schools. We have 21 partner schools. I'm also here at Trinity International University, where in addition to serving as director of the network, I have a few other hats that I wear. And we are really delighted to welcome you this morning. If you want to learn more about us, we're at oikonomianetwork.com. I also want to quickly remind you to please keep your microphones muted unless you are participating actively in the conversation. Thank you for that. We have a series of webinars that we've created this spring, and that's to take advantage of a moment in theological education where there's more opportunity for rethinking what we do and the way we do it than there has been in a long time. So we want to host conversations about what that means and where things are going. We are going to record this conversation so that others can partake in it virtually by watching the video later. That'll be posted on our through our newsletter. I also want to let you know we have a couple of other webinars coming up. I will mention those at the end of our time. For right now, I am going to turn things over to my Trinity colleague and fellow Oikonomia Network folk, Donald Guthrie, who is going to be hosting and emceeing our webinar this morning. So Donald, take it away.
Thanks, Greg. I'm Donald Guthrie, teaching at TEDS these days. We're joined by Tom Tanner from ATS. Welcome, Tom. Appreciate your time with us. We'll be talking with Tom in just a moment about the new ATS standards and implications for all of us. As you all know, probably by now, the new standards are succinct. They're very focused with an economy of words, which we all appreciate. They're principalized, that is, they need to be interpreted by each school. They're holistic, they're meant to be understood in light of one another, and they have a particular focused attention on holistic student learning and formation, perhaps even more than they always have been. As I said, Tom Tanner is joining us. He's director of accreditation at ATS, joined ATS staff in 2012 after a long career at Lincoln Christian University. Welcome again, Tom. Let me get right to the questions, and I'll ask the rest of you folks if you would like to ask a question. We'll have time in about 20 minutes actually to ask your questions of Tom. So if you could put them in the chat, that would be helpful if you have those as we go. Tom, first question is kind of a general question. What are some of the most important concerns that led ATS to adopt a new set of standards for accrediting theological schools?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. I appreciate very much the opportunity to be with you. I'm reminded of a rabbinic story about a rabbi who had a very troublesome student who was always asking him difficult questions. So after the last question he got, he finally responded, "That is such a great question. Why would you trade it for an answer?" So that may be my response to some of the questions you asked today or that we ask here. Great. But let me try to give you at least, I've taken a few dotted points here in my notes. So if I look down, that's why I'm doing that. But there were really four concerns that surfaced from the membership, ATS membership, 275 some member schools, United States and Canada, that led us to think about redeveloping or revising the standards. And those four concerns can be summarized in these four words. One was currency, a second was clarity, a third was diversity, and the fourth was pedagogy. So let me unpack those just very, very briefly, a minute or two on each one. The currency issue is that ATS has had standards since 1938. And about every 4 to 6 years, they get revised. But only about once a generation is there a major rewrite of what we call a redevelopment. The first one was in 1972. The last one was in 1996. So coming up toward 2020, it has been a generation since we'd had a major redevelopment of the standards. We had a modest revision in 2010-12, but the standards that were meant to serve a generation of students in school in the 1990s were starting to show their age. So the membership felt like they just weren't reflecting their current reality. So the currency of the standards was a concern for the membership. A second concern was clarity. As part of the redevelopment process, we looked at accrediting agencies all across North America, and by far the ATS standards were the longest at 100 pages. The second longest was the American Bar Association at 40 pages. Most accrediting standards are in the 20 to 25 page range. So it was just so much material in 3 different sets of standards, 575 different statements, spread out over 100 pages, and a lot of redundancy, and the clarity just didn't seem to be there. A third concern that our membership raised had to do with diversity, and I'm using diversity here in a very general sense, not necessarily demographic or racial or ethnic diversity, but diversity of our schools. The standards prior to 2020 pretty much assumed a one-size-fits-all singular model, and that was a residential campus, students attending mostly full-time and mostly pursuing the MDiv, and mostly white students doing that. That just not reflect the reality of our schools for probably almost 15 or 20 years now, that schools, ATS schools, those 275 member schools, just don't fit that one-size-fits-all model that the previous standards seem to assume. But that's reason why after the 2010-2012 revision, the Board of Commissioners allowed for exceptions, because there were so many things that didn't fit the standards that schools were petitioning for exceptions, so that by the time we got almost to the new standards, the Board of Commissioners had granted over 200 exceptions. But when you grant 200 exceptions to a set of standards, they're no longer standard. So the diversity of our schools, the very different ways they have of offering theological education, it just seemed to say we need something else to take their place. And then the fourth concern that our membership raised had to do with what I would call pedagogy, but it's really something that it surfaced during kind of the predecessor to the redevelopment of our standards, was what's called the ATS Educational Models and Practices Project. And more than 90% of the ATS member schools participate in that. That was a 4-year project funded by the Lilly Endowment to the tune of over $6 million that engaged the member schools all across a broad range, looking primarily at educational models and practices. And what we learned and what member schools were saying is that, wow, there's such a diversity of how we do pedagogy. All of our educational practices have a wide disparity among them. So how do you write a set of standards that focus on best practices for a particular educational model when there are so many different educational models or pedagogies? And if we had followed the traditional approach to standards, instead of a 100-page set of standards, we probably had a 200 or 300-page set of standards, because there would have been a standard for every single best practice, pedagogically speaking, like a standard for online education, a standard for extension education, and so on. So it just seemed to the Board of Commissioners, and the membership authorized this in June of 2018, we just need to rethink how we look at standards and focus this time on not best practices, but on best principles. And that's what led to the current standard. So that's my short, long answer to your first question.
Yeah, thank you. As you said, the new standards move toward more of a principled kind of an approach and away from very specific practices to account for the diversity that you were just mentioning. And it encourages the schools to interpret, to find best practice, and then report. Most of the folks who will be viewing our conversation today are faculty members. Can you talk a little bit about the most important, or at least some new important opportunities for innovation you see for the faculty under the new standards?
Sure. In a couple areas. One, since they're principle-based standards, they don't prescribe a particular practice. So we pretty much say to schools, be as innovative you want to, as long as whatever model you come up with or delivery system or pedagogy attends to the principles of quality identified in the 10 standards. We've gone from 26 standards to 10 standards, from 100 pages to 18 pages. And to say that, okay, like in standard 3, which is student learning and formation, we identify 3 or 4 markers of quality about good pedagogy, like regular and substantive interaction, qualified faculty, evaluation of student work, those kinds of things. And then we say, now, however you want to deliver your curriculum is fine, as long as you attend to those markers of quality. So for faculty, my perception would be that it gives faculty a lot more freedom to say, hey, I want to try something or experiment with a pedagogy or a new curricular program or whatever. And the standards pretty much say, go to it, but just keep in mind these markers of quality. A second area, which I think faculty have a lot more freedom, is that alongside of a new set of standards, the Board of Commissioners and the ATS membership approved a new document called Policies and Procedures. Policies and procedures is basically the ground rules for how you go about petitioning for change or innovation. Under the previous policies and procedures, you pretty much had to petition for every single change. Let's say a school offered 5 master's degrees in the area of Bible or theology. If they wanted to introduce a 6th, they had to petition for approval. Under the new policies and procedures, unless a new degree is in a whole new category, like you've only offered master's and now you're offering a doctorate, or if you've only offered master's in Bible and theology, now you want to offer a master's in counseling, only then you need to petition for approval. Otherwise, you just simply send a notification, a brief 1 or 2 page form to commission staff saying, here's a new program that we're going to implement, and we want to make sure you have that in your records because we have to track all of those. And that can be done usually within 2 or 3 weeks. So it really expedites the process, simplifies the process. So faculties and schools are a lot freer now and more flexible to innovate with change. And the third thing I would mention is I mentioned student learning and formation, which is kind of the heart of the new set of standards. If you think of the standards, the 10 standards as kind of a central core with bookends on either end. Standard 1 and 2 on mission and integrity and planning and evaluation is the first bookend. Standard 9 and 10 on governance administration and then financial resources is the other bookend. But right in the middle is the heart of what I would think is most concerning to faculty. Student learning and formation, the various degree programs, library resources and services, students themselves, and faculty. That's the core of our new set of standards. So we try to focus especially on this theme of student learning and formation because, as you say in the webinar, it's moving from information to formation. So faculty, I think it resonates well with what faculty are most concerned about, and that's how well they can form their own students. So I think that's another area that gives faculty some opportunities for innovation.
Could you say maybe another couple of words about the formation emphasis? Obviously, as you just mentioned, that's a bit of the header for our series here this spring. Maybe a little bit about your perspective on what's led to the emphasis on formation, where we've come from. Wasn't professionalization good enough? And wherever you want to take that would be helpful for us to hear your work, to hear your perspective.
Our former executive director, Dan Elshire, who was director at ATS for like 27 years, retired about 3 or 4 years ago. He's coming out with a new book. It'll come out next month called Beyond Profession, The Next Future of Theological Education. And I've often heard Dan say, he hired me at ATS and I worked with him for a number of years, that theological education, at least in North America, has gone through 3 kind of phases or movements, at least in the last 100 years or so. When ATS began in 1918, in the first pandemic, the influenza, the focus pretty much at that point was on the academy. The first movement was academic respect. We just want to have academic respect as an academy. The second movement, which actually began 20 years later with the implementation for the first time of standards, because for the first 20 years of ATS existence, there weren't any standards. In fact, they had commissioned several reports And the Rockefeller Foundation had a different name at that time, but funded those reports. The first report in 1923 basically said, we have too many theological schools with too few students and too few resources. And the theological schools president said, let's commission another study. We don't like those results. So the Rockefeller Foundation said, we'll pay for another study, but you've got to promise that you'll implement standards of quality, standards of accreditation, which is what they did in the 1930s, the first set coming out in 1936, 38. That set focused on theological education, not as an academic discipline, but as a profession. And that's understandable given the culture in the 1930s, which had, of course, been during the Great Depression, but also a lot of mechanization, industrialization, factory production, trying to get people to work. We need a focus on profession. So a lot of the focus in the early years of our standards for many years, decades, was theological education as a profession, the priest, the pastor, the faculty member. But in the last decade or so, and give or take, Dan Ailshard points out that there's been this shift to a third movement from the academy to the profession to formation, to student learning and formation, to looking at the student as the center, not the profession, but the student, and how that student can be formed holistically and authentically. And the new standards focus on that. The new standards are very careful not to define that for a given school, because the new standards are also very contextual based. So a Roman Catholic diocesan seminary has a different understanding of formation than an evangelical Protestant school in many ways. So we don't tell schools in the standards, here's what you have to do with formation. We just say information matters, formation matters more than information. So how you form students holistically in areas like academically, spiritually, personally, professionally, the school needs to attend to the whole student. So that's the focus in the new standards.
That's great. Thanks.
That was my conclusion, but I'm giving it here early. So.
Right. My next question is about a little bit more about faculty. What kind of faculty do we need to embody, you might say, the new standards, the formation learning nexus? How can deans help faculty? How can faculty help themselves? What are the implications? What are some implications for in-service training and debriefing, and really ongoing lifelong learning for the faculty themselves?
When the ATS membership authorized the redevelopment of the standards in the June biennial meeting in 2018 in Denver, they envisioned this as a 2-year process. The first year was a year of listening, where we just listened to the membership before a single word was written. What do the members want in standards? The second year we called the year of writing and revising. We had 3 different public drafts and got lots of feedback from the membership, which led then to the approval of the standard in June of 2020 at the virtual biennial meeting. But there's also this third year. We're calling this not the year of listening or the year of writing, but the year of implementation, the year of education. That's the year we're in now, and that year may last for a while beyond just a calendar year. And so as a commission staff, there are several things we've tried to do to help faculties and deans and schools live into the new standards. And 2 resources in particular I'd recommend. One is the ATS website, ats.edu. There are 2 drop-down menu options in that homepage, and one of them is called Resources. If you click on that, you'll see that there are resources for presidents, for deans, for faculty, for assessment coordinators, for librarians, et cetera, et cetera. So click on one of those options that fit you, like faculty, and see what resources the ATS is making available. For example, my colleague Steve Graham, who works a lot with faculty, mentioned that we have 44 different faculty development grants that were funded through the Educational Models and Practices Project, and the reports on those are all available on that ATS website. So that's the first resource. The second resource I would recommend, and I'm a little biased in this, is your school's commission staff liaison. ATS is one of the few agencies that tries to make accreditation as personal, as relational as possible, meaning that for every member school, you have your own personal liaison, if you will, who's assigned to that school. And there are 5 of us who do what I do. So we each have a portfolio of schools. But we try to get to know that school well, help that school answer individual questions. I'm on email and phone calls and Zoom all the time with my member schools just to help them understand this. So if you have questions of me, you can always ask. Even if I'm not your liaison, I'll try to get you to the right person. And my email is just tanner@ats.edu. So that's another resource that I think can help faculty and deans in this in-service training. We have a new website we just launched yesterday. In fact, I wanted to get up and running for this webinar, so you'll be the first to hear about this. But if you go to the ATS website under the accrediting tab and drop down to the one called standards, right after the first paragraph, there's a little note there that says, if you want to learn more about the new standards, click here. And it's a link, it's a website called Understanding the Standards. And there's a wealth of information, much more than can be covered in this little brief webinar, about how to really understand the standards, what got us to this point, what's different about them, some frequently asked questions, how do you go about implementing principle-based standards. That's all on that website called Understanding the Standards, under the accrediting menu option of the ATS website under Standards. So anyway, that'd be my response to that question, Donald.
That's super helpful, and kind of on behalf of everybody in ATS schools, yeah, your colleagues and your accessibility is just very much appreciated. I know we benefit greatly from the conversations we have with you all. So thanks, and thanks for that heads up about the website. That sounds like it'd be very helpful too. If we could, speaking of resources, we could return to us. Formation again for a second. I'm thinking about assessment of formation. What sorts of practices do we already have, and maybe we need some new ones to assess how we're all doing with formation as I guess it's not a new emphasis, but it is more of an emphasis in the new standards. So what can we do? What are we already doing, and what can we do that's new?
Formation is one of those challenging things to assess, and using the new vocabulary and the new standards. We talk now about evaluation, whether it's institutional evaluation or educational evaluation. And when it comes to educational evaluation, kind of a central focus in the new standards is formation, the whole student, not just the academic pieces. So in some ways, the new standards make assessment or evaluation more challenging. But I think it's a really good challenge, because I think as a faculty member, you're concerned about how am I really helping students live into their call, the God's call in their life, in all of their dimensions of life holistically. So that's in some ways the standards make that harder, because that's front and center. It's not a sidebar issue, but it's a good hard, I think. The other thing I would recommend is that if you go to the ATS website, in the search option search bar, just type in the word formation, and a half a dozen or more resources will pop up. I'll mention just a couple. One is there's some different articles in our newsletter called ATS Colloquy Online. And one of my colleagues, Joanne Deasy, published an article a year or so ago called 5 Things We've Learned About Assessing Personal and Spiritual Formation. And there's some interesting things in that little 2 or 3 page article about 5 things that you can do at your own school that might help you think in new ways about assessing that. Or another article that was published as part of the Educational Models and Practices project, because in that EMP project, we had 18 different peer groups looking at different kinds of educational models and practices. 2 of them focused on spiritual formation. One of those 2 focused on forming students spiritually online students. And so the article was called How Online Theological Education is Shifting the Formation Model. One of the interesting things we found, every year, many of our member schools participate in what we call the GSQ, the Graduating Student Questionnaire. And in the last 5 years or so, we've been able to distinguish between students who are mostly residential versus students who are mostly online, and ask those graduating students, how would they rate, it's self-evaluation, how would they evaluate themselves in a whole range of categories, many of which relate to formational categories. what we've learned in the last 3 or 4 years from the GSQ data is that students who are mostly or all online believe that they receive better formation through their program being online than the residential students did. No one expected that. But these articles I mentioned, and if you type in the formation, try to unpack some of that. So, in fact, I did a webinar for a ATS seminary last month with their board of trustees. And one of the questions one of the trustees asked me is, we notice in the new standards there's no residency requirements, except for the PhD. But all the other degrees you can offer online or offsite or on campus, however you want, or a combination thereof, once you have comprehensive distance ed approval, I should add. And we also notice in the new standards there's a strong emphasis on formation. She said, is that because people are concerned that with all these online programs, students are not going to be formed? And what we've learned is actually from what I just mentioned, the opposite, that many online students who self-evaluate say that their formation experiences are every bit as good, if not better, than what they would have gotten residentially. And again, that depends on the school. A Roman Catholic diocesan school is always going to do residential formation. That's part of their, what they call a PPF, the Program for Priestly Formation. And many divinity schools will always do residential education. But for evangelical schools and other mainline schools, there are some options out there that the new standards allow that focus on formation, and that there are some resources I think that will help faculties and schools address that. But it's not easy. I give you that right up front.
Yeah, well, very helpful to know about those resources. So thanks for that. I'm about to ask what I think will be my last question or two here. So I invite the live participants again, if you have a question for Tom, if you want to type that in the chat, we can get that to him in a few minutes. Tom, are there other things that you would like, again, faculty members are most probable audience here, but are there other things you would want the faculty members to know about the new standards that we haven't discussed?
Sure. I mentioned at the outside the kind of a paradigm shift going from practice-based to principle-based. And one of the primary reasons for that the redevelopment task force discussed, it was a Board of Commissioners appointed 19 members broadly representing the ATS membership in the US and Canada to help develop a new set of standards to bring to the membership for their input and feedback. And one of the conversations we had early on in that redevelopment, and I was the ATS Commission staff liaison to that task force, was that how can we write standards that really major in the majors, that get faculty talking about things that matter most to schools and to missions and to faculty? And I think the new standards do that. They help faculties and schools really say, look, what is our mission? How are we trying to accomplish it? Rather than focusing on whether or not we should admit this student to a DMin program, or are we over the 15% limit, or who has a PhD and who doesn't. It's just, how do we form students in light of our mission as a school and God's call in their lives? So that, I think, is one of the great opportunities, I think, that are available now in the new standards. The new standards came, we had what we call a series of regional listening sessions, 6 of them during the last year of writing when we were getting comments and feedback. The last one was in Seattle, just as the pandemic was unfolding. In fact, Seattle was ground zero at that time. A lot of fear and anxiety. And I would close my response to this question with this quote. It's my favorite quote, and we had over 2,000 comments we received during the 2 years of listening and writing. But the one that really stands out to me was from a faculty member in Seattle. As the pandemic was emerging across North America, lots of fear and anxiety. He said, I just read the last draft of the standards. And as a faculty member, here's what struck me. The new standards are focused not on a fearful future, but on a preferred future. They speak to what is best about theological education. I can go to my grave a happy man if that's what these new standards help engender in the lives of our students, our faculty, and our schools. So I'm open to any other questions any of you might want to raise.
Yeah, it's a good word to end on. Our hopes for theological education, sort of such as we all are. That's a great note. Here's a question from our participants. Could you speak, Tom, to any specific evaluation practices that you've seen to be particularly effective in providing some kind of measure, both quantitative and qualitative, of growth in the maturity for students formation?
Okay, so speaking to a particular measure, was that the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Specific evaluation practices that might
Right.
speak to both quant and qual ways to
Well,
formation.
there are several, and I'm not an expert in this area, so I defer to some of my colleagues like Joanne Deasy, that article I mentioned earlier, and some of the references in there. But a couple things. One, the assessing spiritual formation or formation in general, as I said, is a challenging issue. And you're not always going to get clear, clean, crisp data, but I think it's going to generate some really helpful conversations among faculty and students about what really matters in God's call on their lives. So even if the measurement is imprecise or not perfect, just having the conversation, I think, is worth it. I would mention what I mentioned a moment ago, the graduating student. There are two types of measurements or assessment instruments, one called direct and one called indirect. I mean, there are others, but those are two big categories. A direct measure tries to get at performance. I mean, if you have a homiletics class, you want to hear the student preach, and that's the performance, and so you evaluate that. But the other is indirect, where you try to get students' own opinion about its perception, not performance, but perception, how they view their own growth or advancement in a given area. And the GSQ, the Graduating Student Questionnaire, I still think is a really good instrument for indirect assessment, because it asks students a lot of questions about formational issues, whether academic or personal or spiritual or vocational. And it's benchmarked against the whole range, against the industry, against all of theological education. So it's a way of finding out not only how your students are feeling about their own formation, but how that compares to other schools. And you can slice it down by your own denomination or own geographic setting or size of school. There's a lot of different ways to slice the data. So I think the GSQ can be a helpful instrument. Beyond that, I think it's I think Biola, Talbot School of Theology, is doing some work in this area, so you might want to check their website. When I was back in my former life, when I was a dean of a seminary in Illinois, we used their instrument. It was kind of just emerging at that time and focused on formational issues. One last area I would mention that can be a real gold mine that's often forgotten is that in any of the professionally oriented degrees like the MDiv or the DMin or well, especially the MDiv, but professional MAs, there's always some kind of a field education component required. And field education supervisors can be a wonderful resource for helping schools measure how well a student is progressing in their own formation, practically and spiritually and personally. And so just conversations with field mentors can, I think, be a helpful resource. That's my quick response to that.
Yeah, thanks. Here's another. Could you say a little bit more about how we differentiate between guided by what you mentioned before, the feared future, as opposed to a preferred future?
Mm-hmm.
That is, how can we, as educators, see what we're being and what we're doing is hope-filled rather than fear-filled?
Yeah, there's an interesting article just came out, I think, today in Christian Century called something along the lines of Conversation about the Future of Theological Education by 4 well-known theologians. And one of the points made in that article was, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a general decline in seminary enrollment, at least among mainline Protestant and Roman Catholic schools, in the midst of all the difficulties from the Great Recession and now all the financial challenges now, these theologians are incredibly hopeful about the future of theological education, as am I. I've been involved in theological education for 40 years. My first ATS meeting was in 1980. And I have never felt more hopeful about theological education. I've been a faculty member. I've been a dean of a seminary. and now working at ATS, I visited easily 100 schools across my professional lifetime in an accrediting capacity. And I've seen so many great stories. And even this year, with the visits all being virtual, here's an amazing thing. In the midst of a pandemic, this is the first time that as a whole, ATS schools are growing. More schools are growing than declining. Because there's some sense of, wow, this is serious. Theological education offers some serious answers. And the new standards try to help schools focus on things that really are important to a school's mission. And so I just have an incredible amount of hope about where we are with theological education. And because we're not dealing with minor issues here, these are life-changing, these are eternal implications. So and we serve a God that is now bound by limited resources or a pandemic. So I just think this is a very hopeful time and a hope-filled time for theological education. Because if we don't have the answers, I don't know who would.
That's a good word. Thanks. I want to thank you again, Tom, for joining us today. Really appreciate your service to all of us, both in this conversation, but overall from ATS. Thanks very much. And I'll turn it back over to Greg for a few final words.
Thank you. And thanks again, Tom. Very, very encouraging to hear testimonies like you're more hopeful about theological education now than at any time in the last 40 years. We really want to keep that hope orientation. So it's very encouraging to hear that testimony from you. We're blessed by that. Thanks, everyone. Before you go, I want to quickly let you know about future opportunities. On March 25th, we're going to have our second webinar in this series, and the title of that one is What I Wish My President/Dean/Faculty Knew in the New Reality. We're going to have a president, a dean, and a faculty member have a provocative and fruitful conversation about how we collaborate across these different roles. As you know, that can be both tense and exciting. But we're very blessed by the folks who have stepped up to join us. We have Barry Corey, the president of Biola University, known to many of you, who's going to be with us. We have Abson Joseph, who is the dean of Wesley Seminary at Indiana Wesleyan University, and Ellen Marmon of Asbury Seminary, our faculty member. So we look forward to a lively and fruitful conversation with those folks. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. And then our third webinar will be, so that one, by the way, is March 25th, just because repetition is some mother of learning. And the third webinar is April 15. So that's tax day. It's easy to remember. If you want to think about something more fun than taxes on April 15, join us for the webinar. That one is called Embracing the Slash After COVID. Increasingly, our faculty folks are professors / some other responsibility at our schools, and that's often felt to be an intrusion. It's not something that we embrace as central to our vision of our vocation as educators. And we want to help everybody embrace that opportunity to be missional contributors to the health and future of our institution, because as educators, that's part of our vocation, part of our calling is to speak into and collaborate in our institution. So we will have Scott Ray, the Dean of the Faculty at Talbot School of Theology. We'll have Philip Thompson, who's at Sioux Falls Seminary and is also a leader in the Kairos Project Network. And we'll have Jesse Swigert from Covenant Seminary will be joining us as our participants in that webinar on April 15. Both of those webinars are at the same time. This one was 11 o'clock Central Time, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. So mark those on your calendar now so you don't forget, and watch our newsletter. The link that you need to click to join us will be in the newsletter the same way it was for this one. If you don't subscribe to our newsletter, first of all, shame on you. Second of all, you can go to oikonomianetwork.com and sign up to get that newsletter. So thanks for joining us. It's been a great conversation. Thanks again to Tom and to Donald, and we will see you next month or whenever the Lord blesses us with collaboration. So thanks, and we'll see you then.